Hello, I am Epahi Borua and welcome to this MOOC on the topic Ethnomethodology. Ethnomethodology gives us a methodical perspective to understand not only what narrators say, but how they say it and how meaning is produced in the social encounter of the interview. Oral history is much more than collecting information from the past. It is a deep engagement with the ways in which individuals and communities construct, preserve, and communicate their experiences of earlier times. As oral history relies on spoken testimonies, it is shaped by memory, identity, social context, and the interaction between interviewer and narrator. Ethnomethodology gives us the tools to pay attention to these interactions. Ethnomethodology is a sociological perspective developed by Harold Garfinkel in the 1960s to study the everyday methods people use to make sense of their world. Rather than analyzing large social structures, ethnomethodology looks closely at the ordinary, routine practices through which people create a shared social order. These practices are so familiar that they often go unnoticed. This attention to everyday meaning making is highly significant for oral history. This is because an oral history interview is not a neutral space. Every pause, hesitation, shift in tone, or word choice expresses not only a memory of the past but also the social dynamics of the interview itself. Ethnomethodology directs our attention to these subtle moment by moment processes through which the interviewer and interviewee jointly construct the narrative. This lecture will therefore guide you through the historical background and intellectual roots of ethnomethodology, its key concepts, how these concepts illuminate the practice of oral history, and finally, how ethnomethodology can be used as a methodical tool in oral history research. Our aim is to understand oral history not just as a record of what happened, but as a collaborative, interactional, and culturally meaningful process in which meaning is produced in real time between the interviewer and narrator. To understand how ethnomethodology contributes to oral history, we have to first examine its historical development and the intellectual traditions which gave a shape to it. Ethnomethodology emerged in the 1960s as a response to the dominant sociological theories which focused on large scale structures, norms, and institutions. Harold Garfinkel, the founder of ethnomethodology, challenged these macro level approaches. He argued that if we want to understand society, we have to pay attention to the everyday interactions through which people produce, maintain, and negotiate their shared social reality. Rather than asking how society determines behavior, ethnomethodology tries to understand how people create order in their daily lives and what methods they use to make sense of the situations, to coordinate their actions, and to sustain the appearance of shared meaning. This transition from structure to interaction and from institutions to everyday conduct forms the heart of ethnomethodology's contribution to oral history. Ethnomethodology draws heavily from the ideas of phenomenology, especially the work of Alfred Scruggs. Scruggs had argued that social life is built on shared assumptions and typifications. He defined typifications as the habitual ways in which people interpret the world. Ethnomethodology adopts this insight and asks how much shared meanings are produced in ordinary conversations. This connection to phenomenology means that ethnomethodology is deeply concerned with subjective experience, the interpretation of meaning, and the life world of participants. These same concerns also define oral history. Harold Garfinkel formalize ethnomethodology as a distinct sociological discipline. Garfinkel particularly focused on the practical reasoning people use in everyday situations. He believed that people constantly employ a set of interpretive skills to make their actions understandable to others. These skills are not usually visible, but they can be uncovered through close attention to the interaction itself. Garfinkel's work gave emphasis on how meaning is constructed through dialogue, how social order is achieved cooperatively, and how individuals actively do social reality through their actions. These themes are directly relevant to oral history interview setting. Harold Sachs' work on conversation analysis became foundational for ethnomethodology. He studied how turn taking, pauses, interruptions, and conversational structure produce meaning. These insights show that communication is not random. Communication follows organized patterns through which the participants coordinate understanding. For oral history, this is significant as everyday interview involves turn taking, shifts in tone, clarifications, moments of hesitation, and subtle interactional cues which shape the narrative being produced. Ethnomethodology and conversation analysis therefore equip oral historians to interpret these patterns. Ethnomethodology also emerged as a critique of structural functionalism, which dominated mid 20th century sociology. Structural functionalism viewed society as a system of stable norms and institutions. Garfinkel challenged this idea, who argued that social order is not imposed from everyday or from above, but constructed from below through everyday sense making. This bottom up perspective is essential for oral history, as narrators do not simply describe events, rather, they actively construct meaning during the interview. Ethnomethodology focuses on the micro processes of social life. These include the small, ordinary actions through which people sustain a sense of coherence and continuity. This emphasis on the everyday practices makes it extremely useful for oral history research. In an interview, narrators rely on shared cultural understandings, conversational habits, and interpretive cues to make their stories understandable. Therefore, ethnomethodology emerged from phenomenology, microsociology, and a critique of large scale structural theories. It focuses on the practical, interactional methods through which people produce social meaning in everyday life. This perspective helps oral historians understand interviews not only as narratives of the past, but as meaning making interactions which occur in the present moment. Let us now look at the core concepts of ethnomethodology. These foundational ideas define the ethnomethodological approach and make it relevant to oral history. There are several key concepts like indexicality, reflexivity, accounts, documentary method of interpretation, and membership categorization devices, which together can explain how people create meaning in everyday interaction. The first core concept is indexicality, which refers to the idea that meaning is always context dependent. Words, expressions, and actions do not have fixed meanings. Their significance changes based on the social situation, the relationship between speakers, and the moment of interaction. This is crucial for oral history. When a narrator uses a phrase like, "we suffered a lot," or "those were difficult days," the meaning emerges not just from the words, but also from the tone, gesture, shared understanding, and historical context. Indexicality thus reminds us that meaning is never detached from situation. It lives inside the moment of expression. The second concept, reflexivity, means that people constantly explain and justify their actions in ways that make the interaction itself appear orderly and coherent. Garfinkel argued that individuals use explanations not only to describe their social behavior but also to produce a sense of social order. In oral history interviews, reflexivity appears when narrators actively shape their stories to fit cultural expectations, personal identity, and moral frameworks. Reflexivity helps the historian understand why a narrator chooses a particular storyline, emphasis, or interpretation. Ethnomethodologists place very close attention to accounts, that is, the explanations, justifications, and descriptions that individuals give in everyday life. Accounts may be descriptive, like, for example, this is what happened. Normative, like, for example, this is what should have happened. Or justificatory, for example, here is why I acted that way. In oral history, accounts are central. They help reveal how narrators interpret their past, how they justify their actions, and how they position themselves within the social and historical events. Accounts show us how people weave meaning into memory. A major of ethnomethodology is documentary method of interpretation. Garfinkel observed that people interpret specific actions in light of an underlying pattern or framework. Thus, it is a document which gives meaning to the details. For example, listeners interpret a narrative by assuming a coherent storyline and fitting details into it. In oral history, narrators often present their experiences as part of a larger meaning framework, like a life story, a moral lesson, or a social identity. Historians have to recognize how narrators use overarching patterns to organize and to explain their memories. Ethnomethodology also examines membership categorization devices. These are social categories that people use to describe themselves and others. These categories include labels like mother, worker, farmer, child, or community leader. These categories carry certain expectations and assumptions about behavior and identity. In oral history, membership categorization devices help us analyze how narrators position themselves, how they describe their social roles, and how they construct identity through storytelling. Identity is therefore not merely told, it is performed in interaction. Conversational order also plays a very important role. Conversational order are the tacit rules that structure turn taking, pausing, topic shifts, and the flow of dialogue. Ethnomethodology therefore studies how people know when they speak, how they repair misunderstandings, how they show disagreements or agreements, and how they signal emotional states. For oral historians, this means that even the smallest elements of conversation, like hesitation, emphasis, laughter, and silence, can be meaningful sources of interpretation. These core concepts, namely indexicality, reflexivity, accounts, the documentary method, membership categorization, and conversational order, forms the foundation of ethnomethodological approach. They help us understand how narrators build meaning in interaction and how oral history interviews become dynamic, collaborative acts of storytelling and interpretation. Let us now understand how these ideas directly inform the practice of oral history. Ethnomethodology offers oral historians a deeper understanding of the interactional, social, and meaning making processes that take place within an interview. Rather than seeing oral history as simply a method of collecting memories, ethnomethodology encourages us to view interviews as dynamic social encounters in which narrators and interviewers co construct meaning in real time. Ethnomethodology treats interviews as social interactions, not neutral extractive tools. What this means is that the oral history interviews are shaped by the relationship between interviewer and narrator, the expectations they bring, the conversational norms they follow, and the social identities they inhabit. Meaning arises through this interaction, not separately from it. The interview is therefore a joint accomplishment. Ethnomethodology also helps us understand that memory shared in an interview is co constructed. Narrators do not just recall the past, they just also respond to the interviewer's presence, questions, tone, and interactions. Thus, the interviewer influences what is said, how it is said, what is emphasized, and what is left unspoken. The final narrative is therefore a collaborative creation shaped by the interaction. It is also important to analyze the conversational cues like pauses, overlaps, hesitations, clarifications, laughter, and emotional tone. These elements show where these memories are difficult, where the narrators feel uncertain, where meaning is negotiated, and how both parties work to sustain a coherent conversation. Ethnomethodology teaches oral historians to treat such cues as meaningful data, not distractions. Indexicality is also crucial for oral history as narrators use phrases and expressions that only make sense within their own cultural and historical context. Ethnomethodology reminds us that we have to pay close attention to the context. We have to look at the social world in which the narrator lives and the situations of the interview itself. The context shapes meaning at every moment. Reflexivity appears when narrators explain their actions or justify their behavior. Such moments reveal how narrators understand themselves and how they wish to be understood by others. Reflexivity helps oral historians see how narrators manage their social identities, how they frame their stories morally or emotionally, and how they maintain coherence in their life narratives. Reflexivity is not an obstacle, rather, it acts as a window into self understanding. Ethnomethodology also highlights accounts as tools through which narrators explain, justify, or rationalize events. In oral history, accounts help historians interpret how individuals make sense of their past, how they negotiate shame, pride, or responsibility, and how they incorporate broader cultural expectations into personal narratives. Hence, accounts reveal meaning making in action. Narrators often use overarching frameworks such as moral lessons or life themes to organize their stories. This is the documentary method of interpretation. Ethnomethodology helps oral historians recognize how narrators construct a coherent document from which individual memories derive their meaning. Narratives become meaningful when they fit into broader identity patterns. Ethnomethodology shows that narrators position themselves and others through membership categorization devices. These categories, like parent, elder, worker, or teacher, shape how narrators recount their experiences and what responsibilities or emotions they emphasize. For oral historians, analyzing these categories reveals the social world that structures the narrator's identity. Ethnomethodology also deepens the ethical awareness of oral historians. When historians understand the interactional dynamics of interview, they become more sensitive to power imbalances, interruptions, emotional cues, and the narrator's comfort level. This helps produce more empathetic, respectful interviewing techniques. Ethnomethodology therefore enriches oral history by shifting our attention from what is said to how it is said and how meaning emerges within the interaction itself. It reminds us that interviews are collaborative, interpretive, and socially grounded events where meaning is constantly being negotiated. We must turn to the practical side and how ethnomethodology can be used as a methodical tool in oral history research. Ethnomethodology does not provide a rigid set of techniques, rather, it gives sensitivity. It shows a way of paying attention to the interactional processes that shape how narratives are produced. This sensitivity guides how we conduct interviews, how we analyze transcripts, and how we interpret the construction of meaning. It directs oral historians to examine the interactional structure of interviews. This includes turn taking patterns, pauses and silences, corrections or clarifications, topic shifts, emotional cues, and the interviewer's participation. Instead of analyzing only on the content of what is said, it asks us to analyze how the narrative emerges during the interaction. The interview thus becomes data, not just the memories it contains. As meaning is indexical and dependent on the context, oral historians have to pay close attention to expressions that require contextual understanding. This may include vague phrases such as at that time, those people, we all knew, it was obvious, etc. Without contextual interpretation, these expressions lose meaning. Ethnomethodology ensures that the historian identifies the cultural and situational frameworks that gives such expressions significance. Narrators also often shape their stories reflexively by presenting their actions in ways that appear consistent, moral, or socially understandable. Ethnomethodology helps the historian analyze how narrators justify behavior, how they frame events, and how they maintain coherence in their self understanding. Recognizing reflexivity helps prevent misinterpretation and deepen analytical insight. Ethnomethodology emphasizes accounts as key object of analysis. For oral historians, this means examining how narrators explain the past, how they rationalize their decisions, and how they construct identities through storytelling. Accounts reveal cultural norms, personal values, and narrators' relationship with their own history. This documentary method of interpretation is a very powerful analytical tool. It helps historians identify the underlying pattern or guiding storyline that shapes the narrator's testimony. By recognizing this pattern, historians can see how narrators select meaningful details, organize events in coherent sequels, and use overarching frameworks to explain personal experience. This prevents superficial analysis and highlights the deeper logic of narrative. Ethnomethodology encourages historians to examine how narrators use membership categorization devices to describe roles, responsibilities, and identities. This helps researchers interpret how narrators position themselves in society, how they relate to others, and how social categories influence memory and meaning. Identity is constructed through the categories that people choose to invoke. Ethnomethodology works hand in hand with conversation analysis. This technique allows oral historians to study turn taking techniques, repair mechanisms, moments of overlap, conversational alignment or resistance, and also the structure of narrative delivery. These insights help researchers understand the dynamic and negotiated nature of oral history narratives. Ethnomethodology improves ethical practice by prompting interviewers to be aware of how their words, reactions, and presence shape the narrator's comfort and expression. This awareness ensures more respectful interviewing, reduced power imbalance, and greater sensitivity to emotional and social cues. Ethnomethodology does not give oral history a set of rigid procedures. However, it provides the discipline with a refined awareness and creates a methodical sensitivity to the interactive, contextual, and co constructed nature of narrative. It enables historians to approach interviews as complex social events where memory, identity, and meaning are actively produced in dialogue. As we come to the conclusion of this lecture on ethnomethodology, let us bring together the key ideas we have explored and reflected on the significance of ethnomethodology for understanding how oral histories are created, shared, and made meaningful. Ethnomethodology offers a unique lens for oral historians. It helps us focus not only on the content of narratives but on the interactional processes through which these narratives are produced. It helps us see that oral history is not a passive recovery of the past, but an active, collaborative, and socially situated event. We began by exploring the intellectual roots of ethnomethodology. We studied its foundations in phenomenology, its development through the work of Garfinkel and Sachs, and its shift away from structural explanations towards practical reasoning of everyday life. This historical grounding explained why ethnomethodology is so well suited for analyzing interviews, where meaning is created moment by moment through interaction. We then examined its core concepts, that is, indexicality, reflexivity, accounts, the documentary method of interpretation, membership categorization devices, and conversational order. Each of these concepts reveal how people interpret the world, construct identity, and maintain social order through ordinary communication. These insights are invaluable for oral history interviews, where narrative meaning emerges through precisely these processes. Next, we explored how ethnomethodology illuminates the practice of oral history. It teaches us how to see interviews as social encounters shaped by rapport, expectations, power dynamics, and a shared management of conversation. Narrators do not simply report the past, they reconstruct it in collaboration with the interviewer, drawing on cultural norms, conversational cues, and identity frameworks. We also saw how ethnomethodology can be used as a methodical tool, which helps us to analyze interaction patterns, interpret reflexive statements, identify indexical expressions, and uncover the underlying narrative structure that gives coherence to personal testimony. It gives us a deeper interpretation and appreciation for the micro processes of storytelling, showing how memories are shaped, how identities are performed, and how meaning is negotiated between the interviewer and narrator. Ultimately, ethnomethodology enriches oral history by reminding us that every interview is a lived social moment. It is a place or space where two people meet, listen, respond, and together construct a narrative that carries traces of memory, identity, emotion, and cultural meaning. It allows us to approach oral history not simply as documentation, but as an interpretive and relational practice which is rooted in everyday methods of understanding the world. In doing so, ethnomethodology deepens our ethical commitment to listening carefully, interpreting responsibly, and honoring the complexity of human experiences shared with us. That's all for today's lesson. Thank you.